Namaskar and thank you for joining us on the Economic Brief, which is our weekly program that looks at key stories from the world of economy from an Indian point of view of the world. Now on the program today, the debate on PPP, that's purchasing power parity measurement of the GDP, it resurfaces, and India has a PPP GDP of around $17 trillion. The US-EU trade deal reimagines the transatlantic relationship. How does it impact global trade? The ASEAN region is bothered by clashes between two of its members, Thailand and Cambodia. Diversion of funds to defense could reduce competitiveness. It's almost 10 years since China scrapped the one-child policy, but Chinese parents need greater incentives to have more children. Now, before we move on to our first story, let's listen to India's Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal. He, speaking in the Lok Sabha, India's lower house of parliament, says that India will defend its national interest and the interests of the farmers, small and medium enterprises. India is negotiating a trade deal with the United States. And the minister was making a statement on US President Donald Trump's decision to impose a tariff of 25% on Indian exports, with an additional penalty for trade with Russia.
हम अपने राष्ट्रीय हितों को सुरक्षित करने और आगे बढ़ाने के लिए सभी आवश्यक कदम उठाएंगे। मात्र एक दशक से भी कम समय में भारत फ्रैजाइल 5 अर्थव्यवस्थाओं में से निकलकर दुनिया की सबसे तेजी से बढ़ती प्रमुख अर्थव्यवस्था बन गया है। हम अपने रिफॉर्म्स और अपने किसानों, एमएसएमई और उद्यमियों की कड़ी मेहनत के बल पर 11वीं सबसे बड़ी अर्थव्यवस्था से शीर्ष 5 अर्थव्यवस्थाओं में से एक बन गए हैं।
Indeed, so let's now come to our top story, and we're talking about purchasing power parity and the measurement of the economy in that respect. Well, what has ignited this debate is an American lady called Kristen Fisher. Now, she has been living in India, and she had a post on social media that had gone viral where she talks about a haircut in the United States costing, about $40. But in India, you can get a haircut for about 100 rupees. So, which would mean that one haircut in India, which costs, 100 rupees, the hairdresser would have to do about 34 haircuts to equal to just one haircut of the United States. So, 34 times that kind of work has been produced in India for one amount of work that has been done in the United States in terms of haircuts. She also goes on to talk about a basic meal which costs about $10 in the United States, but you can get several meals like that in India for 800 rupees, or you can even get a very lavish meal for about 800 rupees. So that is basically what she's talked about, giving to you the understanding that what you can get in India for the equivalent of what you get in the United States is much, much more than you would get in the US. That is the purchasing power parity. Hence, if we look at purchasing power parity, India's economy, which is otherwise in nominal GDP terms about $4 trillion, should be estimated at $17 trillion. Now, that is over half of the US economy, which is at about $30 trillion. Now, the real value, this is the real value actually of goods and services in the economy, because as I was saying, using her example of a hairdresser, 34 times that hairdresser has done that work, and the US hairdresser has done it only once, but that is the equivalent amount that, in terms of dollars, that has been generated. So one looks at it as if it's one job, but here it's 34 times. So hence we produced 34 times the same amount of work that is created, or 34 times those services. So this is also adjusted for cost of living and price. Hence, you can see that that is what purchasing power parity is. It is the real value of the economy. And India is the third largest economy globally in purchasing power parity terms. Let's take a look at the top economies in the world, according to purchasing power parity. Hopefully this will come up behind me. As we can see, China, because China too, like India, has a reasonably low per capita income. So China, the size of the economy, would make it the largest economy in the world at about $39 trillion, then followed by the United States at about $30 trillion, and then India, of course, would come in next, which was, we said, at about $17 trillion. That Russia would be about $7.13 trillion, Japan at $6.77 trillion. The source of this is the IMF funds. We also saw, as I was talking, the countries that follow this in the top 10, that is, the top 10 list. So we can see clearly that, India, if we take in terms of purchasing power parity, both India and China are actually, powerful economies because the ability to produce goods and services at lower costs is much higher than in the other countries. So before we move on, let's listen to the former US Assistant Secretary for Commerce and Trade, Ray Vickery. He's explaining why he thinks the Indian economy, no longer needs protections. However, despite what he says, we should understand that there are still sectors in the Indian economy, like agriculture and dairy, which employ a large section of the population, unlike in the United States, and these sections still require protection.
The other point is that India is going to need to take further consideration about what its interests are in further opening its economy to international competition. When India was first independent, the emphasis was all on protecting infant industry, trying to get away from economic imperialism. That mindset may no longer apply because India has grown in strength. It has had tremendous economic strides, and it needs to think about what's in its interest in terms of opening to further competition.
Well, and to throw light on the subject of purchasing power parity and really what the real value of the Indian economy is, we're joined by Professor Nilanjan Banik, economist, and he's joining us from Hyderabad. So the RBI, Professor Banik, has a roadmap for internationalizing the rupee, starting with cross-border trade and investments. So do you see the rupee over time, gaining ground and helping us to realize the true value, in terms of our economy?
Absolutely, because if you see over the last few decades, if I look into the trend of US dollar vis-a-vis Indian rupees, on average, rupee was depreciating around 2 to 3%. Now, this trend to me is going to get narrower in the sense that our trade with some of the BRICS partners, in particular with Russia and with UAE and Saudi Arabia, we are trying to build in a rupee trade system. And if that happens, going by the flexible exchange rate regime, there will be demand for rupee, and therefore, what is going to happen, the value of rupee in real term is not going to depreciate like what we are seeing as is happening over the last 2 or 3 decades.
So presumably, Professor Banik, it takes, the same time to cook a meal and to cut hair in India as it does in the United States, isn't it? So is it fair that then, an Indian hairdresser has to do 34 haircuts to earn the same as a US hairdresser who has just one haircut to do?
I think you have put it very nicely when you say that purchasing power parity is the real cost of living in any particular economy. So what purchasing power parity is saying, accounting for the difference in cost of living across various countries. Now, what factors which lead into the difference in cost of living? It is the non-tradable items. What are the non-tradable items? It has to do with healthcare, education, going to the haircut, going to watch a movie, things like that. Something you cannot trade with other countries. Now, in India, one reason why this is so cheap has to do with our labor cost. Because in India, the trade union is not as strong as what we see in the developed part of the world. So in terms of the wage rate, which is given to our laborers, it is still kind of much lower than what is otherwise going to happen with a strong labor union. And having said that, we also have a large domestic economy. Almost 80% of the economy is driven by domestic economic activity. For instance, if I look into the consumption expenditure as part of GDP, that is actually driving close to 60% of our economic activities. So whether we see some protectionist measure in the forms of Trump's tariff or other thing coming into place, I don't think that is going to harm our economy, because most part of the economic activities are driven by goods and services which are domestically originated. And because the labor cost is so low, the cost of living is also quite low in India. And in real terms, we are able to get more goods and services per unit dollar of rupee or dollar spent. So therefore, if I look into the per capita income, India's per capita income in absolute term is around 2,700 US dollars per capita per annum. But the moment we convert it into purchasing power parity, that gets inflated to almost 12,000 US dollars per capita per annum. So that is a good thing to note, that our economy is resilient and our economy is growing in terms of the purchasing power of goods and services that we see around.
Stay with us, Professor Banik, for our next story as well. You know, the US and the EU recently finalized what some reports say is a $1.35 trillion trade deal that imposes a 15% tariff on most European exports to the United States, including cars, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals. But the EU has also committed to purchasing $750 billion in US energy products, also investing $600 billion in American industries over the next 5 years. While the deal, avoids a full-blown trade war, critics in Europe are saying that it compromises competitiveness, it lacks transparency. Here's the report. US President Donald Trump announced a trade deal with the European Union aimed at fundamentally rebalancing their economic ties. The EU, with a nominal GDP of approximately $20 trillion, about 1/6 of the global economy, is the world's second largest economy. Germany, France, and Italy account for over half of the EU's total output.
We have stabilized on a single 15% tariff rate for the vast majority of EU exports. This rate applies across most sectors, including cars, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. This 15% is a clear ceiling, so no stacking, all-inclusive. Congratulations.
The deal modernizes the transatlantic alliance, granting Americans unprecedented EU market access. By 2028, the EU will buy $750 billion in US energy and invest $600 billion in the US.
This started months ago, this negotiation. So we knew pretty much what we were getting into, and we were able to make a deal that's very satisfactory to both sides. So it's a very powerful deal. It's a very big deal. It's the biggest of all the deals. It will be the biggest of all the deals. So.
The EU will remove tariffs on US industrial exports, expanding market access of American goods. It will also pay a 15% tariff to the US on autos, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors.
In practice, this was imposed by the United States and the Trump administration, which use all the levers and also some form of coercion, basically, to get an agreement which is unbalanced and, of course, favorable to the United States.
Sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminium, and copper remain unchanged, with the EU continuing to pay 50%. Both sides will discuss supply chain security. The EU will invest $600 billion in the US during Trump's term, on top of $100 billion annually.
There is also one part on purchases of US gas and potentially additional EU investment in the US. Now, this is a quite delicate part on which we do not have much detail.
The US and EU will tackle non-tariff barriers in food, agriculture, streamlining sanitary rules, and in digital trade, keeping zero duties on electronic transmissions. The EU is also committed to major purchases of US military equipment. The Economic Brief, DD India. Well, Dr. Nilanjan Banik, economist, is still with us. Dr. Banik, is this deal going to set the EU back quite a bit? Because the EU's economy is barely able to prevent a recession. It grew 0.5%.
In fact, this is a deal which Mr. Trump, I think, is a clear winner. Because if you look into the EU and the US trade, EU happens to be the largest trading partner for the US. Almost 2 trillion US dollar trade happens between these two regions. Now, earlier, Mr. Trump was threatening to put a tariff of 30%. Now, because of this deal, he has agreed to put a tariff of 15%. But at the same time, the US defense industry as well as the energy industry, these are the biggest winner from this deal, because what they have promised, something you mentioned, European Union is going to buy defense equipment worth of close to 600 billion US dollar, and they are also going to buy energy because they are, the idea is to shift their procurement from Russia to the US in terms of their energy requirement. And the problem is with some of the major automobile manufacturers, be it in Germany or in Italy, because the steel, the tariff on steel is still put at 50%, which means the input cost for manufacturing automobiles, be it for Volkswagen, be it for Mercedes-Benz, be it for any other European-made cars, these are going to get the brunt. Not only the automobile manufacturing industry, but also the defense industry in the US, in the European Union. They are going to get the hit, as well as the pharmaceutical sector. Because what we see in this 15%, none of these big export items by the European Unions are covered. So basically, because European Union is embroiled in the war with Russia indirectly, they had no option but to bow down in front of the US in terms of their demand, because
yes,
what
Dr.
they were
Banik.
thinking.
Right. No, let's move on to also the outcomes in terms of this transactional approach of the U.S. president. How quickly is it going to lead to regional trading blocs emerging, also alternative markets gaining prominence? Because I mean, how long can the world actually take this sort of like you did mention, it's pro-US, so it's looking like one-way traffic in a sense across the world.
So the thing has already started to happen. Like India has already signed a FTA with UK. We are in the process of finalizing another FTA with the European Union. So everyone is trying to look into this kind of regional trading agreement, given the kind of disruption which has been brought in by Trump's tariff, Because at the end of the day, this kind of tariff mechanism is not sustainable in the long run. I'll give you an example of Argentina. Argentina, in the start of 20th century, early 1910 or 1920, it used to be one of the largest economy in the world, even touted to become the largest economy, surpassing US. But then what started happening is they started following a protectionist policy like what we are seeing happening in the US today. Over a period of time, they lost competitive advantage. And now we all know Argentina has actually lost the battle.
Indeed.
So I think going forward, good sense will prevail, and you will see the tariff thing coming down over a period of time.
We leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Nilanjan Banik. Thank you for joining us and putting all this into perspective for us. Moving on to our next story, the recent border clashes between Cambodia and Thailand have exposed serious cracks in ASEAN's ability to manage regional conflicts. Now, the conflict threatens regional stability, economic integration and cross-border trade. ASEAN's influence and unity are under pressure, especially at a time when the US is imposing 36% tariffs on all goods imported from both Thailand and Cambodia, marking one of the steepest trade barriers in Southeast Asia. Anu Kaushik reports.
More than $300 million. That's the initial losses Thailand has estimated from a 5-day border conflict with Cambodia. But authorities warn that the eventual impact will be much bigger. While Cambodia has not released an estimate, analysts believe that it has taken a relatively larger economic hit due to its small and less diversified economy.
Before delving into the financial impact of the clashes, let's take a look at the economy of the two countries. Thailand has a much larger economy with a nominal GDP of nearly $570 billion, while Cambodia has a nominal GDP of $33 billion. Thailand's economy is more diversified across sectors like agriculture, industry, and services, while Cambodia relies heavily on textile and tourism. Tourism is a major factor for both. It contributed about 12% to Thailand's GDP in 2024, while for Cambodia the figure stood at 9%. Thailand's foreign reserves are at over $224 billion, while Cambodia's forex reserves are worth $17.8 billion. Thailand has diversified trade partners while Cambodia is heavily reliant on Thai and Chinese imports. The World Bank expects Thailand's GDP to grow at 1.8% in 2025, while for Cambodia the forecast is 4%. A long drawn conflict will be more detrimental for Cambodia's tourism as some of its prominent sites are located close to the disputed border, but Thailand is also not immune from crisis. Cambodia is a major destination for Thai exports. Clashes would trigger trade restrictions and decline in tourism, which would in turn spark job losses. Both countries seem to be aware of the consequences as they agreed to a ceasefire after US President Donald Trump warned them that trade talks with Washington would not progress if fighting continued.
It's unbelievable. And because he uses trade, he gets to invite me on the phone, and I listen all day Saturday while he's calling Cambodia, Thailand, Cambodia, Thailand. And what happens on Monday? They announce a truce. And you know what we did today? We made trade deals with Cambodia and Thailand.
But the truce remains fragile, with Thailand accusing Cambodia of violating the ceasefire, a charge the latter denies.
If the conflict continues, funds from education and healthcare will be diverted to defense. Regional instability will keep global investors at bay. While the ceasefire is a critical step, sustaining peace requires addressing deep-rooted historical and territorial issues. With camera person Yogesh, this is Anu Kaushik reporting for the Economic Brief, DD India.
Well, in a bid to tackle its plunging birth rate, China has rolled out a nationwide child care subsidy, offering families around $500 a year for every child under the age of 3. Diptanshu Kashyap has the details and we leave you with his report. Thank you very much for watching the Economic Brief. Namaskar.
China is staring at a demographic cliff, with crashing birth rates and the population declining for 3 consecutive years. To contain the crisis, the ruling Communist Party and the State Council have announced a nationwide childcare subsidy to encourage couples to have more children and ease the financial burden of early child rearing.
To adapt to this new demographic landscape, the country is accelerating the improvement of its fertility support policy system, continuously reducing burdens on families of childbirth, raising children and educating them.
The government will offer parents 3,600 yuan, around $500 per child under the age of 3 per year. Over 3 years, that totals to $1,500 per child. According to the state media, the scheme could benefit around 20 million families. China's finance ministry said that about $12.5 billion had been set aside as a preliminary budget for the scheme. The subsidy follows the end of China's controversial one-child policy in 2016, but the fallout from that decades-long rule still lingers. Introduced in 1979, the policy was aimed at curbing population growth as China neared the 1 billion mark, raising concerns about the strain on its economic ambitions. Though adjusted over the years, it's estimated to have prevented hundreds of millions of births. Enforced through fines and coercive measures like forced abortions and sterilizations, the policy left deep demographic scars, from a skewed gender ratio to a shrinking younger population. Today, although couples may have up to 3 children, high living costs and long-standing state restrictions have discouraged many from doing so. Over 20 provincial-level governments already offer childcare subsidies, including cash handouts and extended parental leave, but experts argue these fragmented efforts fall short. Financial incentives alone don't address deeper challenges such as the soaring cost of childcare and education. Between 2020 and 2024, kindergarten enrollment dropped by 12 million and over 41,000 kindergartens closed nationwide. Analysts say this decline is likely to continue as the country grapples with a shrinking population. While this nationwide subsidy marks a shift in policy, analysts say that while the subsidy is a step in the right direction, it is far from enough to address the scale of China's demographic and economic challenges. Deeptanshu Kashyap's report for the Economic Brief, DD India.